As Elon Musk has poured a can of petrol on the scandal of grooming gangs in the UK, I thought it would be a good time to try and get a comprehensive overview of what actually happened in what has become one of post-war Britain's biggest scandals. I wanted to start off by examining the 2010 Orwell Prize-winning blog by Winston Smith, as it provides frontline insight into the atmosphere in UK care homes around the time these crimes were taking place. Many victims of these crimes were already within the child protection system. I remember reading this blog around the time that it came out, and it is quite funny and well written, so I'm going to read a few of them out for you. The guy who wrote it was basically, he was working in some care homes at the time. I don't know whereabouts they were, but in light of the scandal, I think this blog becomes very interesting. So here's one titled Children in Care from February 2009. Well, I've spent the weekend working in 2 different care homes for teenagers being accommodated and cared for by the state. To be honest, as far as I could see, they weren't really being cared for, but rather catered to. Here's what I observed. The first place I went to was a large 5-bedroom house where 3 young girls lived. 2 of them were 14 and 1 of them was 15. The 2 younger girls were extremely wild, are in the habit of constantly absconding from the home for days on end, and getting in all kinds of trouble. The older one was clinically obese, which probably thwarted her efforts to abscond with the other 2. She sat in front of a TV the entire day, hopping the several hundred channels at her disposal, gorging on junk food and intermittently telling me I was a see you next Tuesday. To allow her to live and behave in this way is neglect. Both the younger girls were tagged and monitored by the youth justice system for various offences. They may well end up in a juvenile detention centre should they abscond from the home again. But then again, seeing as the youth justice system fails to deal effectively with more serious youth crime, I'd say the tag is as bad as it will get for these 2 girls. That is a shame, as they need protecting from themselves. They openly talk about taking drugs, and one of them has already had an abortion. What really baffled me was the ease and regularity of their absconding. After all, there are always 3 members of staff, and sometimes 4 in the house, 24/7. So I wondered why they didn't just put a stop to this. I asked Sarah, the senior support worker, how was it they could run away from home with no one stopping them? Sarah, I'm just curious, do the staff fail to notice that these young girls are leaving the home? Well, sometimes they just run off without telling us, but often they tell us they are going out and don't know when they will be back, answered Sarah. Why don't you stop them? After all, they are supposedly in care, and they are only 14 and very vulnerable. God knows what could happen to either of them and what they could get up to. It's simply not right to allow them to wander around for days on end with no clue as to where they are. Look, I agree the whole system is mad, but the simple fact is that we are not allowed to touch them, so we cannot grab them and pull them into the house. That could be construed as assault, and we would get in trouble. We do try to encourage them not to abscond. Does that ever work? I asked. Sometimes, but rarely. If they want to go, there's nothing we can do to stop them. What kind of a care system is this that believes it is better to allow 14-year-old girls to wander about for days on end without supervision, rather than grab them by the scruff of the neck and command them back in their home where they are properly supervised? Do they usually stay away for long? I asked. Sometimes just overnight, but often for a couple of nights at a time, sometimes longer though. Once they were away for 4 nights. What happens is they just get fed up and run out of money or places to stay, and will telephone us and ask for a lift back to the home. This can often be at 3 or 4 in the morning, and we have to get up out of bed and drive and collect them, as we have a duty of care towards them. Is this care or rather a government-funded taxi service for juvenile delinquents? Another support worker, Steve, who was working with us that day, usually works at another home nearby owned by the same organisation. He revealed that absconding in his home was even worse. At least these girls had gone for only a few days, then come back. There are 3 lads, all aged 15 in our home, who all absconded a month ago, and we have no idea where they are or what they are up to. The other support workers and myself still have to go to work, and the home has to be monitored 24/7 in case one or all of them return, as technically they are still in care, and the care has to be there for them should they come back, disclosed Steve. If this is care, I would hate to see what negligence looks like. God, you must be really bored sitting there all day with no residents and nothing to do, I commented. No, not really. The support workers have a laugh with each other. We spend an awful lot of time playing on the residents' Xbox, so that passes the time. The following day I was sent to a completely different care home that housed only 2 residents and had 2 members of staff on at all times. There was only 1 resident present, as the other had absconded, and no one knew where she had gone. The sole resident was a 15-year-old hideous yobette, devoid of manners or respect for others. What's worse is she was indulged in this behaviour by the care system. She was tagged and on a curfew set by the youth justice system, as she had taken a knife to a foreign student a few years older than herself and mugged her for a mobile phone and money. She did this whilst having absconded from the house. I wasn't made aware if she had indeed inflicted any injury on the foreign student in question. At least the foreign student can go home knowing that she experienced a genuine slice of modern British culture. Anyway, as the shift progressed, I watched as the other staff members smoked cigarettes and gossiped with this young girl, who was allowed to smoke. I was given the charge of cooking a roast dinner for the young madam. She wasn't expected to lift a hand to help, and not even wash the dishes. Later on, after I had finished acting as her butler, waiter and chef for her evening meal, I sat down and had an interesting conversation with her. That is, after she finished insulting me. She shared with me her future ambitions and aspirations. Although completely ignorant of almost every sphere of life, there was one area where she displayed a degree of knowledge, and that was how to traverse the benefit system. Did you know you are going bald? You wear funny clothes, she said. This is pointing and laughing at my chinos and hush puppies. Obviously any clothing on a male that isn't a tracksuit is seen as hilarious. I ignored her comments. She was looking for a reaction, but she wasn't going to get one. A few minutes later, she gave up trying to taunt me. I inquired about her plans for the future. I'm going to get a flat when I'm 18 and do whatever I want. They have to give me one as I've been in care. It's the law. She's right. The Homelessness Order 2002 will give her a priority status in obtaining social housing, above that of other individuals, due to her having been in care. Granted, as there is a shortage of social housing, she will not be guaranteed a place immediately, but she will be given a flat long before decent hard-working people on low incomes. If she coupled her care leaver status with being an expectant single mother, she would have double priority status. No doubt she is probably aware of this. At 16, she is becoming fluent in her entitlements and what she is owed by society. I can picture her in a few years with several unruly urchins demanding her right to an even bigger flat. By providing this young girl with these types of entitlements, we are guaranteeing the perpetuation of the underclass for at least another generation. And I'm going to read one more of these out before we move on to the main story. So this one's called Living Arrangements, again from February 2009. Now, when most people hear the term day centre for the young homeless, they automatically picture a building with lots of dishevelled young people ensconced in tattered and frayed sleeping bags, shivering from exposure to the elements, with elderly Christian ladies bringing them cups of tea and sandwiches. In this image, kindly, altruistic people give the poor wretches a minimum and basic level of sustenance before they are flung out into the vagaries of the night. Our day centre is nothing like this. In fact, since Labour came to power, there are very few homeless people sleeping rough each night in England. According to the government statistics, in the 12-month period up to June 2007, there were under 500 people sleeping rough throughout England on any given night. These statistics are roughly reliable in that each local council, as well as local homeless charities, keep count of rough sleepers in their districts. So far, all the young people I've been working with, out of all the young people I've been working with, only 2 are actually without any form of secured accommodation. So if we are a centre for young homeless people, but there are very few homeless people in the city, then just whom do we work with, you may ask? Our service users' living arrangements can be broken down into several categories. There are those who live in homeless hostels run by the council, and in which they will have a project worker or key worker who apparently helps and assists them in improving their lives. I've seen little evidence of that so far. Then there are those who live in supported housing, funded by the government, and where again they have a key worker. These key workers will assist the young person in filling in their benefit forms and informing him or her of their benefit entitlements. They will also create action plans in order to try and motivate the young person into work or education, and in many cases, away from crime. In either a council-run hostel or a supported housing unit, the young person will have his own room and bathroom and will have to share a kitchen with at most 3 or 4 others. All of these young people tell me that they have spacious, heated rooms and that they think their accommodation is more than comfortable. They basically live in complexes or buildings that consist of many large bedsets. The majority of our young people that live in supported housing or hostels do not work, and so the council pay their rent in the form of housing benefit. Then there are the unfortunates who bed down each night in one of the local shelters, where they get a bed in a dormitory full of many unsavoury and disturbed characters. Very few of our service users fall into this category, and those who do usually end up in supported housing before too long. Next, there are those who have council flats or are living in B&Bs until the council house them. This category of our service users are all being accommodated by the local council under the Homelessness Act. In order to be considered as a priority need by the council, you must be considered vulnerable under the criteria of the aforementioned order. Council automatically deem you to be vulnerable if you are 16 to 17 and or pregnant with no fixed abode. Other groups who may be deemed as vulnerable and given priority need status are people with physical or mental health issues, and this can include alcoholics and drug addicts. After ascertaining that the vast majority of our service users are more than satisfactorily accommodated in living quarters by the state, I'm somewhat confused as to our ostensible aim of helping and supporting the homeless. Common sense informs me that only those who are crashing in a night shelter or living on the street should really qualify for our service. I decide to have a chat with my manager about this. As usual, Agnes is hiding in the small and cramped office where she whittles away the days, chain smoking and avoiding any meaningful contact with the service users, members of staff or reality. In fact, when any of the young people ask her questions, she tells them that they must ask one of the volunteers, or me, as it isn't her job. I enter the office and interrupt her rolling up a cigarette and surfing the internet. Agnes, I was just wondering, are you aware that most of our service users are in fact not homeless? She frowns at me with a mixture of curiosity and confusion, so I explain to her all the different types of accommodation in which our service users now reside. Basically, only those in the night shelter or the 2 rough sleepers who could come here could be considered homeless. Well, Winston, technically they are all homeless, in that none of them are in permanent accommodation. And also, the majority of them have to endure supported housing, so they will have to abide by rules and their freedoms will be curtailed. So technically, it's nothing like your own home. I actually completely disagree, Agnes, with your definition of homelessness. So what if they don't own their own accommodation? Plenty of people rent property, they aren't homeless. Actually, you rent. Are you homeless? Agnes, everyone has to abide by rules, and everyone's freedoms are curtailed to some extent. Supported housing is free, and they have to have rules in those places as they accommodate lots of young people. The fact of the matter, as far as I can see, is that we are allowing able-bodied young people who have somewhere to live, paid for by the state, to sit around all day and not be expected to do something to get off benefits. What we are doing is enabling them to stay stuck in the situations they are in by giving them somewhere to hide from reality. Anyway, some of them even have their own council flat. Surely you can't argue they are homeless. Well, those who have their own flats use here as they have a tenancy support worker or key worker, as they may be vulnerable to not being able to maintain their tenancy. Now, Winston, you need to remember that we offer a compassionate, non-judgmental and client-centered service. All this anger is about you and your value systems not being able to cope with their dysfunctional lifestyles. It might help if you realize that these are very sick people who have had hard lives. Most important of all, you need to remember that people change only when they are ready and not when you think they should. They are all on their own journeys. Huh? I don't know what the hell she's on about, so I let her have the last word. Who am I to argue with the wisdom of Agnes, this modern-day Confucius? After all, she has honed this philosophy about our service users from years of experience of avoiding contact with them. The truth of the matter is that without this centre existing for all these young people, her £25,000 a year job would be gone. If she agreed with me, her own job would become obsolete, as we would be sitting in a centre with more staff than service users. It's in her own interest to view people who have free bedsits and flats as homeless, deprived victims. The Lowe family were murdered in August 2000 in an arson attack. Here is how The Guardian reported the story. It was in fact Mahmood who had started the fire. The incident shows how this was a major problem from the late 90s onwards, but legacy media would fail to have any understanding of the severity until 2011, despite plenty of evidence being available before then. I guess they have more important things to talk about. Britain has seen horrific crimes before: the Moors murders, the Hungerford massacre, and Dunblane. But it is the abject failure of the authorities that makes this possibly the biggest scandal in post-war Britain. The first case of what would later be described as a grooming gang being convicted in the UK was a result of Operation Retriever in Derby in 2010. It began when police stopped a car carrying suspected shoplifters to find 3 girls inside who were missing from a care home, along with 3 adult males. The police returned the girls to the home, and they told the officers about what had been happening. An investigation began, and one night 2 girls emerged from a flat that was under surveillance and claimed to have been raped. This combination of luck and basic police work was hailed as a groundbreaking covert operation by the 2020 Home Office report, an example of the obfuscation that surrounds the issue and the poor standards UK police are held to. A wave of convictions followed throughout the decade of remarkably similar crimes across a host of towns and cities in the UK. Aylesbury, Bristol, Halifax, Huddersfield, Keighley, Manchester, Newcastle, Oxford, Peterborough, and Rochdale all had similar gangs operating, and victims were often trafficked to other areas. The overwhelming majority of those convicted came from the Pakistani Muslim community. Another town that suffered in this scandal was Rotherham, a town of just over 100,000 people in South Yorkshire. Through examining both the Jay Inquiry and the Casey Review, I have attempted to build a view of what happened in Rotherham over those years. The story begins in 1997 with the founding of Risky Business, a youth outreach program on a voluntary basis to help young people with a wide range of issues. They were the first to alert councils and police of the sorts of problems going on in Rotherham. Lots of committees were arranged and meetings held between a myriad of child service providers and social workers and key workers and child protection units and safeguarding units. But it wasn't until a child known as Child S was murdered that any concrete action was taken in the form of Operation Central. Despite the fact no council or police leaders could reasonably claim they were unaware of the problem after a 2005 seminar. The Jay inquiry details shocking levels of violence directed against the girls and their families, including the unbelievable cases where fathers tracked their daughters down to the properties where they were being raped, only to be arrested themselves when police arrived on the scene, while no action was taken against the perpetrators. The report by Dr. Heel in 2002 would have alerted police that these gangs were involved in a wide range of criminal activities and that they had access to firearms. Witnesses walked into police stations to give statements, only to back out when they quickly received a threatening text, as the gang was capable of tracking their movements. A case involving one child in the early 2000s saw the victim's brother have his legs broken by the gang. The fact that many individuals feared to make statements as they felt the police could not protect them shows the reign of terror that was inflicted on this small community. How could the police not possibly be highly concerned about this? Social workers dismissed cases claiming the parents can't accept that the child is growing up. The problem with many of these cases is not the lack of support, but misguided support that is at best neglect and at worst a form of enabling. There were many shocked reports by teachers who saw young children picked up from school by older males, not their parents. One case involved a girl who was in explicit photos found on the phones of other students. And if you understand the dynamics of the playground, most kids in Rotherham would have had an understanding of what was happening before their parents and teachers. A heartbreaking loss of innocence. Both Heel and Jay say individuals stated they thought the police were reluctant to act against the Muslim community out of fear of accusations of racism. The Risky Business project manager reported she was told not to mention the perpetrator's ethnicity during training. If you thought the Jay inquiry would spur the council into action, you were wrong. As Louise Casey found in her 2015 report, the council was in a state of denial and was disturbingly disbanded to be replaced with 5 commissioners. Councillors were dismissing the story with a sort of viewpoint that would be generated by a left-wing slop account on Twitter, that it was all the racist lies of the Murdoch press. Once again, the police were found guilty of making the most mind-boggling decisions, like when they arrested a 13-year-old they found drunk in a semi-derelict house full of adult men, but for some reason chose not to arrest or question the adults. The Pakistani Muslim community seemed to be allowed to police themselves by the council. Former deputy leader Jahangir Akhtar was one of the leading figures until he was arrested for fighting in a restaurant. Perhaps the pinnacle of incompetence in this travesty is the only organisation that comes out with any credit, Risky Business, was essentially absorbed into the council in 2011, changing its philosophy of outreach that had previously been so successful. The police had not been undertaking basic tasks, like watching care homes or perpetrators' known addresses. The police showed an inexcusable level of inaction. It was recognised that the victims had been raped, abused physically and emotionally. This resulted in pregnancies, injuries, complaints by parents, reports to the police surgeon examinations. But the remarkable fact is, none of this galvanised action. Casey, page 61. One of the lesser noted but quietly sinister aspects of the Rotherham story is the case of the missing laptops. On the night of the 26th of October 2011, there was a theft of 21 laptops from Norfolk House, a council building. There was no sign of a break-in, and the laptops were known to contain information on both victims and perpetrators of child sexual abuse, strongly suggesting the Rotherham gang had members of the council under their influence. In a meeting chaired by Jahangir Akhtar, it was decided not to inform the ICO about the data breach, as it would risk a fine. The whistleblower who raised this issue claimed the laptops had poor security and were easily hacked. When he refused to accept a demotion and a restructuring, he was made redundant. Many academics, like Dr. Ella Cockbain, wish to obfuscate what happened in Rotherham by writing terrible papers on the subject. The sorts who would have cheered when Sarah Champion was dismissed from the Labour front bench in 2017 for having the audacity to write an article about a terrible crime in her constituency. Dr. Cockbain clearly has a political axe to grind, and her solutions contain more of the same far-left ideology that allowed the situation to arise in the first place, as well as attempting to secure more funding for her friends in the specialty WOG services. Using national statistics on child sexual abuse to score political points does not in any way capture the horror of what happened in Rotherham. Equating a couple of pervs in a van noncery with an armed and organised criminal network that brought other types of violence with it and terrorised the town. A community of around 8,000 managed to produce a gang of such serious criminality that they somehow managed to subject the populace to a regime of lawless terror, infiltrate the council, and have locals believe that the police were powerless to help them. If you doubt this can happen, may I suggest you read The Populist Delusion. The organised 100 beat the unorganised 1,000 every time. Still, the 2020 Home Office report cites her extensively because the Tories love to take their lead from left-wing academics. The grooming gang scandal is illustrative of so much of what is wrong with modern Britain. The horrific levels of violence and sexual abuse is in itself a scandal, which occurred across a wide geographic area over a protracted period of time, with completely inept responses from the authorities. West Yorkshire Police have under 10,000 officers to cover an area of over 2 million people. As levels of crime in small provincial towns have skyrocketed, they have simply been unable to cope and have lost control. There has been a 270% rise in CSA cases nationwide between 2013 and 2020. It exposes the horrific moral decay and violence that exists throughout modern Britain, not just in big cities, but in small provincial towns. It painfully exposes the criminal inefficiency of the bloated and unsalvageable bureaucracy that blights all our lives, sucking in millions while achieving nothing or making things worse. And all this occurred during the wider context of Me Too, in an era when hate crimes that were not even crimes were investigated solely based on someone's assertion. Why then were these cases not charged as hate crimes when there is ample evidence that this is the case, further entrenching the view of a two-tier justice system? During a climate of woke nonsense that in no doubt exacerbated the affair, a climate generated by corrupt media that reluctantly allowed it to become a story but never the story, despite being one of the biggest scandals in British history. Now we must ask ourselves, after all the inquiries and reports and select committee meetings and outrage, has anything really changed?